The main reference in English on edge decoration is John Mitchell's book. In this book, the many variations of edge gilding are covered, including different sizes, different ways of laying down the gold, etc. In this video, I'm not going to cover all the variations. What I'm going to do is follow the technique presented by Jen Lindsay in her book, Fine Binding, where she does rough edge gilding on the tail and fore-edge and solid gilding on the head. This is what the finished product from the video is going to look like. As we go along, I'll explain what rough edge gilding is and how it's different to solid edge gilding. But for now, I'll just say that rough edge gilding is done before the text block is sewn. So the first thing we need is a text block to work on, and that includes the end papers. Actually, I need to explain rough edge gilding from the start. So rough edge gilding is gilding the edge before the text block is sewn. It can be done on untrimmed or trimmed edges, and in this case I'm going to do it on trimmed edges. So I'm getting this text block together, I'm marking the head, and then I'm going to put trim lines on it because I'm going to trim the tail and fore-edge on the plough before sewing. So why do rough edge gilding? Traditionally, when gilding the edges of books, you either do just the head or all three edges. Now the head is the most vulnerable to dust and moisture buildup and for moisture infiltration to the text block. So it makes sense to gild the head of the text block. Now gilding the fore-edge of a rounded book is really difficult. It's hard to gild a non-flat edge. It's possible, but it's a lot harder. And finally, there's an aesthetic aspect to rough edge gilding. The slight misalignments of the sections once the book is sewn produces like a faceted look to the edge of the book. And this is accentuated by shuffling the sections before doing the gilding. Now, because I'm using blank paper, it doesn't make sense to shuffle before the gilding, and I actually shuffle the sections after doing the gilding. But if it was a book with content, then you would shuffle the sections before doing the gilding, and that would accentuate that faceted look to the edge. So I'm trimming the tail and fore-edge. When I trim the tail, I knock the book up to the head, and when I trim the fore-edge, I knock the book up to the spine. So what aspects of edge gilding can vary? I like to break it up into three components. There's the edge preparation, how you flatten the edge if it's flattened. You can also edge gild on deckled edges that aren't trimmed, but how you prepare the edge, the size that you use to stick the gold to the edge, and the final one is what you do to it after you've put the gold on the edge. How do you burnish it afterwards? So Jen Lindsay takes a very different approach, I think, to the other main influences on edge gilding, which is John Mitchell and maybe Peter Garrity in the US. And for me, the most striking difference in Jen Lindsay's approach is the use of gelatin size. And this took me a while to get used to because I'd been using either starch or PVA size. After a lot of experimenting, I've come to the conclusion that I think that gelatin size is the easiest method to use and the best one to start doing edge gilding with. It's very easy to prepare. Just mix 1/4 teaspoon of edible gelatin with 60 milliliters of boiling water, stir it up and let it cool. But you want to keep it warm, otherwise it sets. I'll be using gilding boards, which are wedge-shaped boards similar to backing boards. except the top is flat instead of sloping shoulders. I have tried using sloping shoulders as well, and if I remember, I'll explain why I've gone to flat tops later. But before I use them, every single time I plane them flat again, because they will develop little hollows from the smoothing process or the edge preparation process. I always talc the edges to prevent them or help stop them sticking together. So I just fan out the edge and use a brush to brush a bit of talc in, and then I use my fingers to work it into the edge of the book a little bit, and then I put it between the gilding boards and put it in the line press. Now I should pad out the book with a few millimeters of paper either side. It's just a lazy habit of mine to forget to add that padding, but it is a really good idea because often the defects are right on the edge of the book, and though that padding will prevent that, or the defect will be in the padding and not on the book. Edge preparation is absolutely everything in edge gilding. It has to be completely smooth. Now it doesn't have to be completely flat, because the scraping process and the sanding process, you may end up with the absolute slightest of unevenness in the surface, but that's unnoticeable. But what will be noticeable is the smallest of scratches. So I start with the scraper and then I use fine sandpaper. I'm using 400 grit. You may want to start with a coarser and then go to 400, but I think just use 400. I have a whole collection of soft natural bristled brushes that I use for different purposes in edge decoration techniques. This brush is only used for cleaning up after sanding or scraping a edge. It's my dirty brush. That's all I ever use it for. At this point, you do not want to touch the edge. Any grease from your fingers will stop the gold sticking to it. The next step is an optional one in Lindsay's book that she uses for soft papers or papers that need some sort of filler. And she uses diluted paste, and I'm using straight paste, but I just use a cotton wool ball to wipe a bit of paste on the surface, and then a clean soft bristle brush to brush burnish the edge. Lindsay says, immediately brush the edge vigorously with a short bristled brush like a nail brush or a shoe brush, but bristle, not nylon, as it will scratch the edge. Brush across the edge initially, then along. Brush until the edge is dry and shiny. Obviously, I forgot to brush along. The next step is to apply a thin layer of Armenian bole being this red-coloured clay. Now, Lindsay uses a solid block of bole. I don't have a solid block, I've only got the powdered bole, so I put a very small amount, like maybe 1/8 of a teaspoon of bole, into a petri dish, and then I put some gelatin size on the bowl, and I stir it up, and then using my natural sponge, which I've already rinsed out with clean water, I pick up the bowl and put a thin layer over the edge. This is another variation from most approaches. This, I think Lindsay wants quite a translucent layer. Most people will use a more opaque layer of bole. While the edge is drying, I'll prepare the gold. Lindsay seems to prefer paper tips, so that's what I'm going to use. And because this is the first time I'm using them today, I'm going to clean any grease off them. I'll also clean the grease off my gilder's knife if there's any on it. I'm going to use isopropyl alcohol. Some people use lighter fluid. I'll only clean the tips once a day. So before I use them for the first time that day, I'll use these tips maybe 4 or 5 times on this day. If I was going to use them more than 6 times that day, I might clean them again that day, but I don't clean them every time that I use them. You want to start from a known starting point, otherwise you'll have too much grease built up on them and the gold won't release. So once I have cleaned them, I'm going to put some grease on them, and I'm going to use the grease from my hair. So once the isopropyl alcohol's dried, I'll then rub them on my hair to put some grease on them, a controlled amount of grease, which will help pick up the gold. Without this, the gold won't be picked up by the tips. I always keep 2 books of gold on hand when I'm edge gilding. One is the active book with all the fresh sheets of gold in, and the other one is where I keep all my odds and ends. So it's a used book that I use to keep the stray bits of gold in. They're really important for edge gilding because you use those to do patches and repairs. If you want more information about handling the gold, then there's the video on making the gilding cushion. I'm just going to lift this sheet out of the book and put it on the gilding cushion, and then say the letter P over the sheet of gold to flatten it out. Then I'll cut the gold into strips between 5 and 10 millimeters wider than the edge of the book, depending on how carefully you think you can get the gold down on the edge of the book. I like to draw the knife completely off the gold before I lift it up, because if the gold is going to grab to the knife, if you lift the knife before you've pulled it off the gold, it's likely that the gold will go all over the place and be ruined. Now I will load the tips. I will pick up the gold with the tips. Now I'll roll the paper down onto the gold, and I want less than 1 millimeter overhanging, and it didn't stick at one end. That's no big deal. I'll just blow on it. You want to be able to see the gold sticking out over the edge of the paper, but if too much is hanging out, it will break, and then that break will propagate through the gold when you lay it down on the edge. So less than 1 millimeter. You just need to be able to see it from the back side of the tip. So that's almost perfect. That's as good as I get. Now this piece is wider than I need, so I'm going to cut a thin strip off, which will be really handy for repair work. There's no point wasting gold. Once the paper is laying on the gold, I just run my finger across it very lightly, just to make sure that it grabs the gold. I would normally do this prep work out on the lying press near where I'm working, but just for the quality and ease of videoing, I did this in my other room. But wandering around the building with loaded gold tips is probably not the ideal thing, because you're likely to pick up dust, etc. Now is when the magic happens. So I'll put the prepared gold on the press in the order that I'm going to use them. And then what I'm going to do is brush very carefully the gelatin size onto a bit more of the edge than I'm going to cover, and then put the gold on the edge. I'm going to try and not touch the edge with the paper tips. I'm going to bring it down parallel to the surface, and hopefully just before it touches it, the gold will jump off onto the edge of the book. That was far from perfect. Now, when the gold comes off the tips, you can hear a sound. And if it goes well, it sounds great, and it's a very satisfying sound. And this one goes fairly well. So I think that's about as good as it gets for me. I don't think I'll ever do any better than that. Now, you want the gold to overlap as little as possible, but it has to overlap. So if you can, just 1 millimeter. Mine normally overlap by 2 or 3 millimeters. So I think that was a reasonable success. I've got some creases in that first sheet. However, they haven't torn, so I think they're going to be okay. In the next 2 edges, I'll demonstrate some repairs, one on the wet edge and one on the dry edge. So this is 1 hour later. I normally wait 1 hour, which is probably longer than necessary, but I think it's better to err on the side of the edge being dry rather than wet. You can see that the gold sucked down quite nicely. Another significant difference with Lindsay is she does not set the edge with a cotton pad while the edge is wet. So the next time she touches the edge is with baking paper to lightly burnish the edge with an agate burnisher through the baking paper with the slippery side, the silicon side, up. You can also use ordinary paper and just put wax, beeswax, on the upper surface, just so that the agate burnisher glides smoothly over the paper. Once it's been burnished lightly through the paper, then we'll put a thin layer of beeswax on it and burnish it directly. Now, you never apply the beeswax directly. I like to rub the beeswax into the palm of my hand, which is warm and sweaty, so it sort of melts the wax a little bit. And then I rub that onto my thumb, and then I put a very thin layer of beeswax onto the edge with my thumb. Now, to get a really shiny edge, you will build up multiple layers of beeswax on the edge, and each time you burnish, you can burnish with a bit more pressure, but you really don't want to create lines on the edge. And unfortunately, at one end, I end up pressing too hard and do put a couple of lines on the edge, and nothing I did would get rid of those, so don't put too much pressure on the edge. For this being for a client, then I may have started again. But since it's a demonstration, I'll live with it. One of the things I've noticed following the Lindsay approach is that the final product isn't as mirror-like as following the other variations. And I think that's because Lindsay doesn't burnish the edge before laying down the gold. And I think you can only really get as smooth an edge as what the paper, how smooth the paper is before putting down the gold. So I think if you really do want to get a mirror finish, then you need to follow some of the other approaches and burnish the edge before putting down the gold. And there's a few things that you have to watch out for if you do that, and I hope in the future I'll do some more videos on edge gilding where I'll demonstrate these different techniques. Now, you'll notice that I've already done the head there, and I don't know why, but I did the order of tail then fore-edge. In Lindsay's book, she's very specific and says to do the fore-edge then the tail. Maybe I just forgot, but I would normally do it that way, do the fore-edge then the tail. So now I'm going to do the tail, and I'll try and remember all the points that I've forgotten to address and address those now. Now for this demonstration, I'm just using cheap modern copy paper, which is just terrible to work with. It is just so hard. Once it's compressed, it's harder than the wood, so it's quite hard to prepare to work any scratches out. Softer paper, slightly softer paper is much nicer to work with, but obviously more expensive. Now, if you don't know about how to sharpen a card scraper, I've got a video on that. And the other thing to mention is when you're sanding, always sand in the direction of the edge, never sand across. You'll get scratches in the edge if you sand across that will show through the gold. Something else that I do that's different to Lindsay is that Lindsay is just paranoid about dust. I try and be as clean as possible, but I'm just not as careful with dust as Lindsay obviously is, and thus I'm more likely to get defects in my edges. I don't think I've mentioned those little covers that I've made, but they're common with bookbinders working with gold leaf, and you put those over the leaf when you're not working with it to stop it blowing away. And I guess when we're talking about dust, those covers also stop dust settling on the gold as well. I had a strange experience about a month before I did this video. I was doing a lot of edge gilding at the time. At least every other day I was practicing edges in preparation for this video, but it was a Sunday, and that day the paper tips weren't picking up the gold. The gold wouldn't stick to the paper tips. And it took me a while to realize, because it was a Sunday and I wasn't going out, no one was going to see me, I decided not to put Brill cream in my hair. And without the grease of the Brill cream, the paper tips just wouldn't pick up the gold. Now here's an example where things don't go quite right. So the gold is torn. I'm just going to put that one aside and use that for any repairs. And as it turns out, I'll need it on the next edge. The next two go reasonably well, and because I'm doing a short edge, the tail, 2 pieces is enough to do the complete length, or you would expect. If you don't use Brill cream or have very dry hair or maybe no hair, then the other thing you can do is get a little bit of Vaseline, just a tiny amount, wipe it on the back of your hand, and then wipe the tips over the back of your hand. But be very careful, use a very small amount of Vaseline. It doesn't take much to make it so that the gold won't release off the tips. So I'll go through the steps again, starting with the starch paste. Now, as I mentioned before, this copy paper edge is really hard, so there's no real need to fill it. However, I do still like doing this step because it starts to add a bit of moisture to the edge, and the moisture content on the edge is a really important factor with edge gilding. I haven't really talked about it. It's really complex, and it's something that you develop a feel for. Well, I'm starting to develop a feel for. So I like to start introducing a little bit of moisture to the edge early, even if it's not necessarily needed for this hard edge. That is the filler. Now I also put the brush in the gelatin size early, just so that any bubbles can work their way out and the gelatin size can soak into the brush. I do wash the brush so the bristles are wet before I put it into the gelatin size. And I always rinse out the sponge after I use it, even if I'm going to do a second edge or more edges that day, just because it dries out and it's such a quick job to prepare some more bole. And I use it all, I just use a tiny amount of bole and I use it up each time. And that way the sponge is at the same level of wetness every time I use it as well. As I mentioned before, I think every other approach I've either seen or read about on edge gilding uses a more opaque layer of bole, and then that edge is burnished with an agate burnisher. Well, not always, I guess, but usually with an agate burnisher before laying down the gold. Now, if you decide to do that, you do need to clean your agate burnisher with a solvent to make sure that there's no wax, grease or oil on the burnisher, because if you do get any wax, grease or oil on the edge, the gold won't stick to it. So make sure you clean your burnisher if you're going to burnish it before laying down the gold. Now, gently take any bubbles out of your brush before you put the size on the edge, because any bubbles will show up through the gold. You're trying to keep the paper tip absolutely parallel to the edge without bending the paper and getting it close so that it all jumps off at once. Ideally, you don't want the paper to touch the edge, though it's sort of hard to not do that. If it does, it often causes a little wrinkle in the gold. Usually that's okay. It's really hard not to bend the paper. Now, somehow I've missed the first few millimeters of this edge, but luckily I had that piece of gold that tore at one end, so I can just use that to fill in the area that I missed. Now, where the gold overlaps, the top layer of gold will normally brush off. If you're lucky, it will almost be unnoticeable, though maybe I'm not as skilled, but often you can see the overlap in the finished product. Now, after this dried, I was surprised to find what looked like a hair, so I decided to fix this. I'm going to pull the hair off and then patch it. Now it's dry, so I need to reactivate the size. So I'm going to use saliva and a very fine brush. Well, it's not a very fine brush, a fine brush. And now I've picked up the gold with a piece of cotton wool, and then I just apply that after I've reactivated the size. And then I let that dry maybe 20 minutes. So that's how you patch a defect after the edge is dry. You really need to reactivate the size, and Lindsay suggests the magic of saliva, and it seems to work really well for small defects. She does suggest that for a very large patch that you could use a gelatin, but that it does stain the gold, so you really have to be careful with it and only get it where the patch is. The main deviation I take from Lindsay's approach is using the flat burnisher. Lindsay recommends using a dog tooth burnisher, but I just haven't been able to make that work on a flat edge. And I don't know if it's the shape of my burnisher or what it is, but it's probably technique for sure, but it just doesn't work for me, so I can't really demonstrate something that doesn't work for me. But she does recommend using a dog tooth burnisher. So once I've finished this edge, I'm going to sew the book, glue the spine, round the book, and do the solid gilt head edge. Now, if this had been a printed book, I would have shuffled the sections before doing these edges in the rough, and so I would have had to put the sections back in their correct order. Or in this case, I shuffled the blank sections, but I forgot to get some video of me doing that. I just pointed to a minor defect in the edge that I'm going to live with, because really at this point, once you've put wax on the edge and burnished it, you can't repair it. So if you find a defect at this point and want to fix it, all you can really do is plow off the edge and start again. So I've sewn the book, I've glued the spine, now I'm rounding the book. Now I could back the book as well and I have found that that works fairly well, because then the book is in its absolute final configuration, so that once you do that solid edge on the head, it won't be disturbed at all. However, with this really hard copy paper, I've found that it's really hard to get the gilding really nice at the spine where it's not compressed. With softer paper, it's very doable, but with this paper it's not. So I'm going to round but not back. So at the start I mentioned that I had tried using boards that had sloping tops and flat tops. I moved to using sloping top boards because I saw someone else using them, and there's less wood that needs to be scraped away if you need to work the edge down a little bit. So I thought it would make it easier. But what I also found was that when you're trying to get the book between the boards, it can rock from side to side. So it's actually harder, well, I found it harder, to get the book flat level with the tops of the boards. I found it easier to do if I'd planed the tops of the boards flat. So that's become my personal preference, but I have seen in books and from what people have said, both ways. So it's one of those things that you just need to try it and come up with your personal preference. So this time I'm going to put a thicker layer of bole down, so it's going to be much more opaque, which I don't think is what Lindsay intended, but I was curious to see if there would be a noticeable difference in the final edge, whether the final edge would be a warmer colour. Now, of course, the gold is incredibly thin, and the colour under the gold does affect the colour of the finished edge. So these warm colours under the edge result in a warmer coloured gilt edge. If you want a cooler coloured edge, then you would put graphite underneath the gold. This time the gold is going to tear as it goes down onto the edge, resulting in a significant defect, which I'm going to repair while the size is still wet. Now I get lucky here because I should put the patch down using a paper tip. Instead I use a cotton pad, and I shouldn't really be touching the edge with the cotton pad while the edge is still wet, and I really just get lucky. The other thing I should point out is when I put that second lot of size down, I don't put it onto the gold. It's just from the wet edge along. Okay, so you can see that tear in the gold. Now I'm just going to quickly get a piece of gold out of the book, out of my repair book, and I'm going to pick it up with a cotton pad, and I should really pick it up with a paper tip, but I was just in a bit of a rush, and I just got lucky that I didn't tear the gold on the surface putting it down this way. Another tip is to breathe heavily on the surface you're about to put a patch on, and that condensation helps with activating or keeping the size activated. It looks a bit of a mess, but all the excess gold's going to rub off and the final product is, well, acceptable. So there's two reasons that I like this approach I'm calling the Lindsay approach. One is the use of the gelatin size. I think the viscosity of the gelatin size means that it's a lot less sensitive to the moisture in the edge and the humidity and temperature on the day that you're working. So I think the gelatin size makes it a lot more user-friendly. The other thing is the paper tips. The paper I use is just 150 GSM smooth drawing paper. There's nothing special about it. I cut it about 10 centimeters long and 4 centimeters wide. It's just drawing paper, fairly heavy but not too heavy drawing paper, smooth. You don't want a texture, otherwise the texture will be transferred into the gold. So using the paper tips, it's just one less piece of specialist equipment that you don't need. So this video has turned out to be a bit of an epic, so congratulations if you've made it this far. I didn't know what I was going to talk about for 35 minutes, and I don't think I've shut up the whole time. So I hope you've enjoyed the video and that you've got something out of it, and I hope that gilt edges have been demystified and that you give it a go. It's not really that hard and you don't need any super specialist equipment. There are a few things that you do need, but it's very worthwhile. So I hope you've enjoyed it. As always, I really appreciate you hitting the big thumbs up button. If you want to be notified of my future videos, including more on edge gilding, please hit the subscribe button. But until next time, cheerio.